103. In Spain, where I reside, the gap is smaller, but still substantial, 289 minutes for women and 145 for men. American time surveys of 2010, 15, 17, all show consistently with very little change, men spending less than half of what women spend on housework or time caring for household members, including their children. A 2014 report by the OECD Development Center concluded that around the world, women spend 2 to 10 times more time on unpaid care work than men. And in 2019, the OECD reported that women and girls globally do 75% of all unpaid care and domestic work. Now, harms to women that accompany their doing the lion's share of unpaid care work are wide-ranging, and they differ substantially both across countries and within countries, depending, among other factors, on class and race. Focusing only on socioeconomic costs and only on the European Union, women, as is well known, experience a substantial care penalty. This is the loss of earnings women experience as a result of taking up part-time employment or low-quality, low-paid sector jobs. And as well as the gender earnings gap, they're at the short end of a pensions gap, reflecting their unequal participation in employment and full-time employment in particular, and the gender gap in poverty, with women more likely to experience poverty or social exclusion than men. Now, thanks to the work of feminist political philosophers like Susan Okin, Eva Kittay, Sharon Lloyd, Martha Nussbaum, and more recently, other liberal, self-avowedly self-declared liberal feminists, Semi Baer, Gina Schutten, Laurie Watson, Christy Hartley, among others, liberal egalitarian theorists of justice who had largely neglected the questions of gender justice until the late 1980s, now acknowledge that their views must and can buttress the conviction that it is unjust to women that their socioeconomic prospects are worse than men's on account of the gender division of unpaid caring labor. Now, while mindful of the injustice of the gender division of unpaid caring labor, however, most liberal egalitarian philosophers have not asked head-on what their views have to say about unpaid caring labor as such. That is, whether and why it is unjust for caring labor to be unpaid, in the broad sense that undertaking it is costly in terms of prospects for advantage for those who undertake that labor. Now, this question is distinct from the question of whether it is unfair that this work or this labor be distributed unequally and along gender lines. It's one thing to say that, assuming that the socioeconomic payoffs of caring labor are negative for those who undertake it, then that labor should be shared by all, or at least that it shouldn't be shared in line or depending on what sex one is, and that everybody should be equally free to choose to do it or to avoid it. And it's another thing to say that it is justified or unjustified that the socioeconomic payoffs of caring labor are negative. And the latter question is the question that I'm addressing, that I want to address in what follows. My question is whether liberal egalitarianism can support the claim that it's unjust that caring work is unpaid, where the injustice at hand is not reducible to the injustice of its being distributed unequally along gender lines. Now, what I want to do is to give an affirmative answer to this question, and I want to do it in a very unlikely way. That's to say, by showing that a theory of equality, of liberal equality, that has been taken to be very hostile to accommodating the claims of carers and of women in particular, Ronald Dworkin's view, can actually buttress an affirmative answer to that question. I'm going to proceed I'm going to have two main parts to my talk. The first one, in sections 1 and 2, I'm going to say a little bit more about the question that I'm trying to isolate as important in this feminist debate on unpaid caring labor, and characterize an argument that I'm ascribing to many feminists. And then in the second part of the talk, in sections 3 to 5, I'm going to try and make this resources case for sharing the costs of caring and parenting in particular. Now, before I proceed, let me just make quickly 3 clarifications. First, I've talked until now, and I will sometimes continue talking about unpaid caring labor, but I'm going to focus mostly on caring for one's own children. I think that the conclusions that I reach can be extended to cases of caring for adults who are not one's own children, and certainly to children that one adopts, and to other adults that one is not related to. But I take it that the case of caring for one's children and having to show that it is unfair for that labor to be unpaid is the hardest case. It's the hardest case quite simply, well, it's for a number of different reasons, but here I'll highlight one, which is that as many egalitarians who are willing to accommodate considerations of personal responsibility in their views have underlined, procreative parents, I'll talk about procreative parents from now on, choose whether or not to have children. And they're not, I'm assuming, under a moral obligation to have children. So it's a choice that they make. It's a morally permissible choice, but it's not one that they have any moral duty to make. And because of this and the number of other features that I could discuss, if you like, later on in discussion, the case of children is, I think, especially tricky. Sorry, more specifically, the case of showing that there are demands of justice for sharing or socializing, as I sometimes say, the costs of children that one has chosen to bring into the world is especially tricky. Secondly, let me just say again, I've already mentioned this, that by paid and unpaid throughout from now on, I mean these terms quite broadly. I don't mean waged and unwaged. I mean to refer to whether or not certain payoffs of caring or parenting in particular are positive or negative, where these payoffs are in terms of prospects for advantage. So they refer for sure to monetary costs, but also to costs in terms of, say, pension entitlements, costs in terms of time, and so on. And finally, let me note that I do make some idealizing assumption. So as I've already implied or said, parents choose to have children. I assume not in the sense that there are no norms that are pronatalist, but in the sense that they're free enough for them to be potentially held liable to various obligations, and indeed for them to be the ones who can claim to have special rights vis-a-vis the caring of their children. And moreover, I assume that apart from the injustices under consideration, the gender injustice in the various dimensions that I'm trying and unpack, there are no other injustices in the picture. So the parents or carers are not at the short end of other injustices. And I also assume that children themselves, their needs will be attended to. So we are asking who should pay for the costs of this care, assuming that the care will be given. Okay, so with these clarifications in mind, let me go on to say a little bit more about the question I'm trying to isolate. Because women everywhere do the lion's share of unpaid caring work, and they're seriously disadvantaged as a result, the two questions that I mentioned a moment ago, and which I'd like to separate, may seem very hard to prize apart. So in order to proceed, I'd like to spend a few moments on isolating clearly and bringing into view the question that I'd like to focus on after this section. The two questions I separate are, to repeat, first the question of whether and why it is unjust that there is an unequal and gendered division of caring labor, and second, the question of whether and why it is unjust that caring labor is unpaid, in the broad sense of unpaid. Now, I believe that most feminists' indictment of the gender division of unpaid caring labor rests upon an affirmative answer to each of these two questions, where neither answer is reducible to the other, and rightly so. So I think that feminists hold that it is unjust, that there is an unequal and gendered division of caring labor, where the injustice in question is not reducible to the injustice of caring laborers being unpaid. I'll refer to this as the violation of equal opportunity claim. And they also believe, I believe, that it is unjust that caring labor is unpaid, where the injustice in question is not reducible to the injustice of that labor being unequally distributed along gender lines. And I'll refer to this as the exploitation claims for reasons that will become apparent shortly. As well as believing that there are these two separate concerns that feminists voice, each one of them not reducible to the other, I also believe that not enough has been done by either feminists themselves or by liberal egalitarians who have taken on board feminists' calls to accommodate concerns of gender justice within their theories, to disentangle these two concerns and to provide a sustained argument for the exploitation claim. But the exploitation claim does need to be vindicated. If it were not vindicated, if the injustice of the gender division of unpaid caring labor were fully reducible to the injustice of caring labor being unequally distributed along gender lines, then feminists would have, in many ways, no more reason to condemn the injustice of women's doing the lion's share of unpaid care work than there would of condemning the injustice of a social scheme in which women are confined, say, to the unpaid work of counting grains of sand. Or more realistically, the injustice of women's incurring substantial material and health costs, which men do not, in order to live up to gendered beauty norms. But they do have more such reasons. It's unjust to women that they do the bulk of unpaid work which is unpaid, despite being, so feminists have said again and again, socially valuable and indeed indispensable work. I'll just say very briefly that by saying that these are two claims that feminists are committed to, that neither is reducible to the other, I don't mean to suggest that they're not connected, and that we shouldn't study the ways in which the two concerns interact, so to speak. So for one thing, we may think that the injustice done to women as a result of suffering both of these wrongs is more than the sum of the individual wrongs themselves. And this is plausible, and I'm not going to say anything about this in what follows. But as I said, my aim here is to districate or extricate the question of exploitation, of the concern of exploitation, from the concern about the violation of fair equality of opportunity. Now, before I move on to do that, or before I move on to give an answer, to seek an answer to the question of why it is unjust that caring labor is unpaid, where that injustice is not reducible to the fact that that labor is unequally distributed along gender lines. Let me just mention a few places where feminists have made this claim, the exploitation claim, on behalf of women. I think it is striking that feminists, both of older generations and new generations, and from, if you like, across the feminist spectrum, from Marxist feminists to ethicists of care and other feminists critical of liberalism, like John Toronto or Virginia Held, Nancy Fraser, Carol Pateman, but also feminists who are sympathetic to liberal egalitarianism. So Eva Kita herself, Susan Okin, Joan Williams, Martha Feynman, Nancy Folber, all of these feminists, like others who have more recently raised concerns about the crisis of care, agree that part of the injustice done to women is that they're disadvantaged as a result of performing work that is socially indispensable. And that society at large, not just their male partners, owes it to them to share the costs of caring. Here I've reported on your slide just a few of the quotations. One is by Silvia Federici, who was one of the founders of the Wages for Housework Initiative in 1972. And there, she's a Marxist feminist, called on the need to reappropriate that money, which is the fruit of our labor, of our mothers and our grandmothers' labor. And more recently, reflecting on the Wages for Housework Initiative, she continues to write that domestic work's devaluation, monetary and otherwise, continues to be a problem for most of us, women. Similar claims are made in the Feminists for the 99% manifesto. One of the authors is Nancy Fraser. They, again, linking their critique or their feminist claims with a critique of capitalism, say that one of the things we must do, feminists must do, is to make visible the indispensable role played by gendered unpaid labor in capitalist society. Writing from a very different perspective, Shirley Berggraf, she's an economic liberal, writes that when we become conscious of the family as the socially productive institution that it is, the question of how to reverse the current disinvestment in the family appears critical. The family has absorbed much of the human race's energies and resources in order to perform essential social roles and economic functions, and so on. I've reproduced here other quotes for you. Now, I think that these and many other feminists voice, fully or in part, versions of what I will, for now, I'm liking the label less and less, continue to call, rather, the public goods argument. It consists of two key premises, that argument. The first is a largely empirical premise, which is that by having and raising children, parents discharge an indispensable role. They produce essential benefits for society at large. And then there is a normative premise. It's unfair to those who produce essential benefits for all, those who perform socially necessary work, to set up our institutions in such a way as to make them internalize all or most of the costs of what they do. This second claim, it should be clear, is a more fully spelled out version of what I earlier referred to as the exploitation claim. The conclusion that feminists who advance versions of the public good argument uphold is that sharing the cost of children among all members of society, socialization, is required by justice. Carrying labor, even if it remained permissibly, let's suppose, unwaged, should not be unduly costly for those who undertake it. Now, I'm not going to say anything here about what it would mean for it not to be unduly costly, but I have in mind at least that the familiar and quite generous package of family policies, including publicly funded parental leave, childcare, schools, and so on, possibly other forms of child tax credit, and other forms of also changes in the workplace would be called for in the name of the public goods argument. So my question in what follows is, can a liberal egalitarian theory provide the normative premise for this argument? Now, Antonio mentioned that I had written about this in the past, and I should say that the search, I think, for a plausible version of the public goods argument, I believe has so far proven elusive. That's why I'm having another go. So granting the empirical premise, the question is there a defensible normative principle that can vindicate the charge of unfairness? Why exactly is it unfair to producers of public goods or those who freely, willingly engage in socially valuable activities, not to share in the cost of productions of those goods? And can this unfairness charge be applied to parents? The only philosophically well worked out defense of the argument, to my knowledge, until now, is the one that was reconstructed initially in part by Eric Rakowski and then more fully by my colleagues Paula Casale and Andrew Williams, who have all rejected the argument. And that version of the public goods argument appealed to the principle of fair play, formulated initially by Herbert Hart and John Rawls. For reasons I will not go into now, but I'm happy to expand on later on, I believe that despite what I said in my 2013 paper, we should abandon the fair play principle in the debate on the public goods argument. But can an alternative defensible normative foundation be found to buttress the charge of unfairness or exploitation? And I think, as I've said, Ronald Dworkin's theory of equality of resources can. It's a surprising claim, I think. And in making that claim, I will in part kind of reinterpret or give my own interpretation of certain aspects of equality of resources, which I think is faithful to equality of resources as stated by Dworkin, but which I think has been misunderstood. And then hone in or focus on one part of the ideal of equality of resources that people generally talk little about and that has been entirely ignored in the context of discussing the case for sharing the costs of children. Now, I did want to say here at some point before going on to Dworkin, why I'm not turning to roles for the task at hand, but I'm worried I'm going to run out of time. And I hope that I can say what I was going to say, some very brief observation in the Q&A for, if nothing else, very self-interested reasons. I'd like to hear what others think about roles on this question. So let me turn instead to Dworkin. So I'm going to proceed in 3 stages. So let me just tell you up front what the 3 key steps are. The conclusion I wish to defend, as I've already mentioned, is that equality of resources can capture or can ground the case for socializing the cost of children, but more specifically, that it can do so by capturing demand to not exploit producers of valuable goods, of whom parents are an instance. Now, the 3 steps in which I will proceed are as follows. First, in the next section, I will identify the aspects of equality of resources, of the ideal of equality of resources, that enable it, so I claim, to capture claims of non-exploitation or productive fairness. And these are, to anticipate, the commitment to devoting equal resources to the ambitions of each person, where, and this is crucial, the metric of equality, where impersonal resources are concerned, or where people differ only in their ambitions, are the opportunity costs to others of people's taking resources for themselves. Then, in a second step, in section 4, I go on to highlight how, armed with this conviction, equality of resources can indict treating the resources that people produce as being fully on a par with manna from heaven, and condemn exploitation in this specific sense. And finally, in section 5, I will argue that this counterproductive fairness can be applied to parents, just like it applies to producers of private goods, because the account needs to be extended to and can be extended to the production of non-commodifiable goods. Okay, so just a very, very brief reminder of some of the main commitments of equality of resources and the foundational ideas that underpin it. Now, according to Dworkin, equality of resources is the ideal of socioeconomic justice for a government that treats all its citizens with equal concern and respect. Dworkin also believes that the right way of understanding the demands of equal concern and respect is through the lenses of the 2 principles on the slide. One is the principle of equal importance, and one is the principle of special responsibility. The principle of equal importance states that it's important from an objective point of view that human lives be successful rather than wasted, and it's equally important from the objective point of view for each human life. And the principle of special responsibility states that though we must all recognize the equal objective importance of the success of a human life, one person has a special and final responsibility for that success, the person whose life it is. I'm sorry about this. I had charged others with caring for the dogs, but it's been ignored. Okay. Now, the 2 principles have the following implications that are relevant for us. Because of the principle of equal importance, equal resources should be assigned to each person. So Dworkin says, whatever the community has to assign by way of goods or resources or opportunity should be assigned so far as possible equally, so that roughly the same share of whatever is available is devoted to satisfying the ambitions of each. And as is well known, more specifically on Dworkin's view, no one should get more resources than others because of people's economic background, he says, race, gender, or particular set of skills and handicaps. Nor should anybody get more resources than others because of a collective judgment about the comparative importance of people or the comparative worth of projects of personal moralities. Because of the principle of special responsibility, equality of resources does not mean, for Dworkin, flat equality, that is, equality simply in material goods. As Dworkin notes, there is nothing to be said for a world in which those who choose leisure, though they could work, are rewarded with the produce of the industrious. Moreover, the principle of special responsibility also implies that each person's subjective evaluation of her situation will play a role in determining whether the resources she commands are equal. Now, there are various places, I think, in which that it's helpful to distinguish places in which subjective evaluations play a role in equality of resources, but only one of these matters for my purposes here, so I'm going to turn to that. Now, as I've said, equality of resources devotes equal resources to the ambitions of each person. Ambitions are a person's life plan or choices. On equality of resources, assuming that people differ only in their life plan and choices, in our case, we're assuming some choose to be parents, others don't, equality is realized by giving people an equal bundle of impersonal resources. But how do we determine whether bundles of impersonal resources are equal? On equality of resources, how much others value what each gets is essential for determining whether what each gets is an equal bundle of resources. This is because equality of resources obtains when what each person gets has the same value as what everyone else gets, where the value of what each person gets is measured in terms of how much others thereby forego, judged by their lights. This is what Dworkin means when he says that his ideal adopts opportunity costs as the metric of equality. So the opportunity cost to you of my getting a piece of land, for example, are the potential benefits you miss out on, what you have to forego, as a result of the land going to me rather than being put to some other use. Now, this idea that equality of resources is, as I put it sometimes, equality in the opportunity costs that each imposes on others, I think is of crucial importance for understanding Dworkin's ideal. I think it explains why markets play an essential role for equality of resources, both actual and hypothetical. And I believe it's more fundamental than a different idea in his theory that is often used to determine whether resources are equally distributed, namely the so-called envy test. The envy test is the better known idea, but I think it's less important. So let me say something more about each of these two things. First, markets. Equality of resources holds that resources are equal if the opportunity costs that persons impose on each other by dint of possessing resources are equal. The opportunity costs that that you're possessing a resource imposes on other persons are recalled the potential benefits that the others thereby forego as measured by their lights. This is a complicated function of both what you will do and what others would have done with the resources in question. Markets, both actual and hypothetical, are necessary devices for measuring the opportunity cost that any person's possessing of resources imposes on others. Dworkin notes the market enters as the best means of enforcing the fundamental requirement that only an equal share of social resources be devoted to the lives of each of its members, as measured by the opportunity cost of one's appropriating such resources to others. Let me now relate the idea of equality of opportunity costs with the idea of the envy test, which is, as I've said, and as you will know, the more widely discussed basis for determining equal distribution when people invoke equality of resources. The envy test tells us that a distribution of resources is equal only if no one envies the resource bundles possessed by any other person. No one would prefer, as Dworkin once put it, someone else's bundle of resources to her own. Now, I submit that the envy test is a test of equality of resources only because and insofar as it tracks equality of opportunity costs. This matters for my discussion below and is generally overlooked. So I must emphasize this point, just pause a moment to emphasize it and clarify it. Envy freeness, whereby nobody prefers anyone else's bundle of resources to her own, is in many cases a reliable proxy for equality of opportunity costs. If the value of your bundle measured by what I have to give up is judged by my lights, is the same as the value of my bundle, measured by what you have to give up, as judged by your lives, then neither one of us envies the other. So when our bundles are equally costly in the sense of equality of opportunity costs, then the distribution of resources is envy-free. Equality of opportunity costs guarantees the absence of envy. Inequality of opportunity costs will also often be picked out by the envy tests. So in many cases, when our bundles are unequal in the sense at hand, in terms of the opportunity cost metric, then the envy test fails. For example, if we each value equally having both a piece of land and access to the sea, and I appropriate the only half of the land that has access to the sea, leaving you the other landlocked half, then it is true both that the opportunity costs to you of my appropriating the seaside piece are greater than the opportunity costs to me of your appropriating the landlocked piece, and that you envy my resource bundle, in the sense quite literally that you would swap the bundles if you could. But now note that while the envy test can sometimes track inequality of opportunity costs, it doesn't always do that. And one such case is mentioned by Dworkin himself when talking about the initial scenario in which shipwrecked survivors are on an island and must divide the resources, and he supposes that we're going to use the auction to determine what an equal distribution of resources is. At one point, he asks us to imagine that all available resources are magically transformed into a large stock of plover's eggs and claret, and then divided into identical bundles of baskets and bottles. In this case, Dworkin notes, although many of the immigrants are delighted, the one who hates plover's eggs and claret will feel that he's not been treated as an equal in the distribution of resources. Now here, Dworkin himself says, the envy test is met. He does not prefer anyone else's bundle to his own, but he prefers what he would have had under some fairer treatment of the initially available resources. So to recap, if there is equality of opportunity cost, then envy-freeness is guaranteed, but the opposite is not true. It's not the case that whenever there is envy-freeness, there is equality of opportunity costs. For my purposes, in defending the case for socializing the costs of children by using equality of resources, these observations are important. To be able to make a resources case for socializing the costs of children, it matters that the role of the envy test for equality is more limited and more superficial than it has been taken to be. More specifically, it matters that the tests being satisfied does not ensure that there is equality, and relatedly, that we needn't show that there is envy for us to point to relevant inequality of resources. And it also matters that equality in the opportunity cost that people impose on one another, and not primarily envy-freeness, is the guiding and underlying principle. So just to clarify, these things matter to me because we need not show that parents envy non-parents, as some people have suggested, for us to make a case for socializing the cost of children on equality of resources. If we can show that equality of opportunity costs requires that the costs of sharing be shared, then the absence of envy is irrelevant. Now, in what I go on to do next is to try and show that it is indeed the case that equality of opportunity costs requires that the costs of caring be shared. I'm not going to talk about envy anymore. And to show that, we have to focus on a part of the ideal that of equality of resources that is generally under-discussed. And as I've said earlier, it's altogether ignored by people who have been, there are not very many, but people who have looked at implications of equality of resources for the question of how the costs of children should be distributed. Now, discussions of Dworkin's view, as I've said, don't dwell much on examining what it requires concerning production and trade, where, just to emphasize again, there is no inequality in brute luck or in talents or external brute luck between people. People differ only in their ambition. Assuming that persons differ only in their ambitions, as I've said already a number of times, equality of resources requires that the distribution of resources reflect the costs and benefits, I'm now quoting from Dworkin, to others, of the choices that people make, so that those who choose to work in more rather than less profitable ways must be permitted to retain the gains that flow from these decisions in an equal auction followed by free trade. Now this, as I've said a few moments ago, is what ensuring equality of opportunity costs requires. Because equality of resources is realized when the bundle of resources that are assigned to each person's ambition is equal, measured by the opportunity cost to others of each person's having those resources. And since an idealized market must achieve equality as measured that way, equality of resources demands that producers, that's to say those who create goods and provide services which others need or want, acquire what Dworkin calls more bank account wealth than those who have non-productive ambitions. It's in this sense that equality of resources captures considerations of productive fairness. So, as I've said, assuming that people differ only in their ambitions, it is unfair on equality of resources to producers to treat the benefits that they create as being, morally speaking, on a par, fully on a par with manna from heaven, which may or must be redistributed equally without any consideration of the fact that someone produced it, where this means specifically without the fact that someone produced it making any difference to how producers and others' bank accounts should end up. To do so, I think, on the equality of resources would be to allow some to gain at the expense of producers in a way that is contrary to equality of resources. Now, this, I'm sorry for the extremely long quote, I've cut it down as much as I could. These points, I think, should be clear, I hope, if we consider the example that Dworkin uses to illustrate his view of productive, what I'm calling productive fairness, his view with regard to production and trade. In an example, we have two characters, Adrian and Bruce, who differ only in their productive ambitions. Both wish to acquire previously unowned land, Bruce to use it as a tennis court for himself, and Adrian to produce tomatoes, which we are to assume others want to buy. Now, the question we face is, how should equality of resources price these different ambitions, so to speak? Would it be fair if equality of resources, equal resources, say half the land, were devoted to Adrian and Bruce? So half the land, or by allowing Adrian to bid for the land entirely, but then redistributing tomatoes to Bruce after Adrian has produced them? The answer is negative. What equality of resources requires is settled by using the auction or market device, because remember, this is the appropriate means of ensuring that equality of opportunity costs obtains. And equality of opportunity costs via the auction or market requires unequal bank account wealth for Adrian and Bruce for equality of resources in the relevant sense to obtain. Now, you probably had time to read the quote, but let me just take you quickly through the following crucial statements. In this example, we must ask, Dworkin says, that when we ask what Bruce should pay for what his account should be charged, what the price of his tennis, we might say tennis playing ambition is, the way we should settle that question is by asking, or by reference to the ideal of the metric of opportunity cost. His account should be charged the amount that others would have been willing to pay had the land been devoted to their purposes instead. The appeal of the auction, Dworkin emphasizes, is precisely that it enforces that metric. But this scheme will fail, and the device disappoint us, unless Adrian is able to bid a price for the same land that reflects his intention to work rather than play on it. And then Dworkin goes on to say, we reach the same conclusion if we look at the matter from Adrian's point of view. If someone chooses to have something inexpensive in his life under the regime of equality of resources, then he will have more left over for the rest of what he wants. And a choice for production rather than leisure is the choice of something inexpensive. And it would violate equality of resources if the community were to redistribute Adrian's wealth, say, at the end of each year for that reason. Equality of resources prices, so to speak, the productive ambition more cheaply than Bruce's unproductive one. Now, this rationale, let me emphasize, is what underpins Dworkin's often cited claim in discussions of responsibility-sensitive egalitarianism that equality of resources tell against forcing the ant to subsidize the grasshopper. If we distributed resources from the ant to the grasshopper, we would be violating equality of resources by enabling the grasshopper, who has an expensive non-productive ambition, to gain unfairly at the expense of the ant's inexpensive one. The ant would, in this sense, be exploited by the grasshopper. Now, I know I'm running quickly out of time, so I'm going to go through the following selectively, selecting just a few of the key points I want to make. Now, in order to show that these considerations of productive fairness apply to parents, the first thing that we need to do is the following. In formulating equality of resources, Dworkin notes that it's an ideal of distributional equality. He admits that, or he notes also that there are other aspects of equality, but what he doesn't notice is that the distribution of the ideal of distributional equality itself, not the other aspects of his ideal that have to do, for example, with political equality. Distributional equality itself must surely have implications, not just about goods that we can own and trade, but also about goods that, for various reasons, are non-commodifiable. Privately ownable resources do not exhaust the resources that affect whether material equality obtains. So we must ask what the ideal implies for what we could call the economy of non-commodifiable resources. Now, there are a variety of these goods. By talking about non-commodifiable goods, I just want to refer to a range of goods that cannot or may not be owned and or alienated and or be alienated for money. These include, most obviously, public goods, goods that display, that's to say, some degrees of non-excludability and non-rivalry, but they also include publicly owned but divisible goods, for example, a government-owned land or roads or buildings, private goods which are non-ownable and or non-tradable, that's to say their production, broadly understood, the provision of these goods and their consumption, again, broadly understood, is by individuals and for individuals, but individuals don't have either moral or legal or both private property rights over what they produce and or consume. So we could think of aspects of body and mind that are non-commodified or non-commodifiable in this sense, organs, tissue, DNA, and so I want to suggest the goods or some of the goods of children. So with regard to these goods, we should ask the same question that Dworkin asks about privately ownable and tradable goods, assuming that people differ only in their ambitions concerning the production and consumption of non-commodifiable goods. What does equality of resources entail about how their bundles should be affected for equality of resources to be preserved? Now, I think the answer to that question at the principled level is quite straightforward. Recall that when people differ only in their productive ambitions, I've said this a number of times, their bundles should reflect the net value or disvalue to others of their exercising those ambitions, measured by the metric of opportunity costs the ideal uses. The facts that the goods that are being produced are non-commodifiable rather than commodifiable does not matter fundamentally for establishing what producers are owed. So for example, imagine in a modified Adrian and Bruce example, that Adrian cannot, for whatever reason, receive the money directly for the tomatoes that he grows. When he receives the money from buyers, the money just vanishes through no one's fault. Suppose furthermore that Adrian's happy to receive payment in the form of funds deposited into a fund that will pay for a house when a certain sum is reached. Then equality of resources would require that Adrian's resource bundle include the house purchasing fund, just as it required where tomatoes were fully tradable, that his bank account wealth grows bigger than Bruce's. Or suppose in a further revised version of the example that there's only one direct consumer of tomatoes, a state-run agency, not because people don't value tomatoes, but because by acting as monopsonist, the state agency can provide tomatoes to all those who want them, but who cannot, for reasons I don't need to get into, access to matters. Again, it seems that nothing changes fundamentally in terms of what equality of resources requires about what Adrian is owed. The state-run agency should now ensure that Adrian's resource bundle reflects the value to others of his productive ambition in the form of a house purchasing fund, the magnitude of which mimics the prices that Adrian's tomatoes would have fetched if the tomato consuming households could have bid for the tomatoes directly. So neither the fact that the goods which producers produce cannot be exchanged for money, nor the fact that they cannot be priced by an actual competitive market makes a fundamental difference to how productive ambitions should be priced. Now, with these points in mind, and I hope without causing any offense, we can imagine a third Adrian and Bruce example, in which Adrian would like to bid for resources which he intends to use not on growing tomatoes, but on having and raising a child. Now, to know what Adrian's account should be charged, what the price of parenting should be, we could say, we should once again know what the opportunity costs are to others of the resources being put to this use rather than devoted to other purposes instead. If we grant in the example, in the simple example that we're using, that Adrian's parenting ambition is productive, Adrian will spend time and energy and some of his material resources in raising a child who will in due time be an asset to society in various ways, then Adrian's bundle of resources should reflect that fact. It'd be unfair to Adrian to price his parental ambition as if it were expensive, when in fact, in the relevant sense, in terms of the opportunity cost metric, it is a cheap one. Adrian's ambition would wrongly be priced as expensive if Adrian had to use his own resources to bid for what he needs to raise a child, in the same way in which Bruce has to use his resources, fairly in Bruce's case, to purchase land on which to play tennis. So I think I'm out of time. So I just want to conclude by saying the following. To say what I've just said about the parenting ambition as a productive ambition, I take it is not to settle on one particular way in which we should proceed in the name of equality of resources to avoid exploiting parents. Let me clarify this. Notice that we could avoid the unfairness to parenting Adrian in one of two possible ways. We could either reproduce as closely as possibly, compatibly with respecting, of course, the fact that children are non-commodifiable and they're moral equals, the scheme that we established with tradable and ownable goods. Right? So we could, for example, set up pension schemes in a way that allows parents to reap Social Security payments more extensively, or even, it's conceivable that the only kind of, at least with pay-as-you-go pensions, it would only be parents who have a claim to the pension scheme. And you could imagine a split welfare system that gives parents special claims over at least some amount of their children's taxable earnings, right? At least up to a certain point. Right? So I'm not talking about children, I want to emphasize, owing anything to their parents directly, or their parents having some kind of patria potestas over them. I'm talking about just where should the taxable revenue of the next generation go. Now, I should say that some people, including one feminist I mentioned earlier, Shirley Burgraff, advocate something like a privatization scheme. Okay. But there is an alternative. We can socialize instead both the costs and the benefits of children in the way in which, as I've said earlier, current welfare states do to greater or smaller degrees. Now, I believe that as far as considerations of productive fairness itself go, either of these two regimes or either of these two ways of ensuring that productive fairness is done is fine. But to say that is not to say that the overall ideal of equality of resources is silent on which of these two schemes we should adopt. And I think there are other parts of the ideal of equality of resources that tell in favor of socialization over privatization as a way of sharing the costs of children. I think I've said enough. I don't know how surprised people are by the idea that we could as well as should, enlist equality of resources in a case for sharing the costs of children. It is a surprise, I think, certainly that something potentially like Dworkin's view could lend itself to making a case to this effect. Having children, I think, if the empirical assumption of the public goods argument is granted, is not an expensive taste on Dworkin's view, quite the opposite. And I think it is a welcome implication, or one welcome aspect of this surprising conclusion, that on Dworkin's view, socializing the cost of children would not be a matter of heeding parents' claims to being accommodated or to receiving subsidies for any kind of brute luck disadvantage. By contrast, the kind of case I've tried to put forward suggests that just as we recognize that grasshoppers shouldn't exploit ants, so we should not exploit carers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that very interesting talk. I would like now to ask people to raise their hands if they have questions, commentaries, etc. This is quite some food for thought, and so I would expect to see some comments. Oh, sorry. We can start with you, Professor Freeman, please.
Thank you, Serena. I mean, you mentioned Rawls. He does say, I think, in Justice, Fairness, or somewhere, that childcare by parents is socially productive labor, and that as such, parents who stay at home and raise children are engaged in a kind of production that has social value, so that should be compensated, and presumably that would be under the difference principle. I mean, however you would value the value of their labor would be covered by that, and that's in addition to he talks about family allowances. Would be in addition to that, because family allowances would be to rate the costs of raising the children, but this would be production costs for to meet parents' productive labor. But let's assume, I mean, I just want to see how the Dworkin account works out. So you assume, so in Rawls and most liberals, right, have and this goes to how Dworkin deals with claims of basic needs. So Rawls has a principle of basic needs, right? Which is separate and apart from what people are due for engaging in productive labor under the difference principle. So let's assume a system that pays for public education for children, their health insurance, basic nutrition, housing vouchers, and also gives family allowances for the cost of raising children. So all their basic needs, so you can, however you're going to determine that, are met. Is your claim that, well, if we assume that, yeah, that covers the costs of child rearing, but it doesn't compensate parents who provide for care of children for their productive labor in raising children. And that in addition to that, Dworkin's account requires compensation of parents for their labor in caring for and raising children. Is that the way the argument's conceived, that this is something in addition to all that, and that's compatible with Dworkin's view, which is a so totally different question? I'm not so sure about that, but I mean, Dworkin has a peculiar way of dealing with basic needs, as if it's but that's the question. Yeah.
Thank you. So, well, I'm going to try and answer first a second, and then I'll go to Rawls, because I'd like to hear more about Rawls from you, if I may. But So with regard to the latter issue, so I want to say, I think I want to say two things. First, indeed, I do believe that depending on how we work out the specifics of the Dworkinian view that I'm trying to formulate, it may indeed be that the kinds of costs that have to be shared also include the costs, some of the costs of caring labor. Right? So it's more than just covering basic needs satisfaction for children. But I wasn't so much focused on that here or on trying to establish a conclusion. I don't think that's why we need Dworkin. I take it that we need Dworkin for even the first claim, which is that the costs of satisfying children's basic needs should be shared between all members of society. So, as I said at the very start, I think the question that has been raised and that's a few people have contributed to, from Rakowski to my colleagues Andrew and Paula, Hillel Steiner and Peter Valentine, myself, a few others, is assuming that there are indeed moral demands. Someone must meet the costs of meeting children, or someone must bear the costs of meeting children's needs. So we're granting that children's needs make moral demands, and then we're asking who has, as a matter of justice, who has an obligation to bear those costs. And the worry that I'm trying to respond to is the worry that, at least under some partly idealized conditions, the answer to that question is those who have chosen, avoidably, morally speaking, to bring children into the world. Even if we say having children is socially valuable labor, we might think if people enjoy that labor, if people don't need incentives to do that labor, then we're not under an obligation of justice to share the burdens of that labor with them. So that's the position I'm trying to respond to.
Yeah, I mean, the position I recited at the beginning and asked what's Dworkin's position. I mean, basically, I see that as Rawls's position. There's a principle of basic needs. It's implicit in the first principle that requires that everyone's basic needs be met. That's going to be children. And it's going to mean a kind of social guarantee that, whatever children's basic needs are also going to be met in being raised, right? Like public education and so on, maybe, and also fair quality of opportunity that may require some kind of even prenatal care, child care, and so on. So there's just a wide array of publicly or social benefits that you're going to find in a position like Rawls's, even before you start talking about what is owed to people for their productive labor. My sense is, well, one way to look at Dworkin is that he covers all the basic needs that, say, Rawls would cover just by a different principle. But does his account really address what's required in addition to all the benefits, social benefits that children deserve? Does it also cover paying parents for devoting, 12 hours a day to raising their children as productive labor that would be paid for under a principle of distributive justice that only addresses the fair distribution of the social product, right? And that's what Rawls's difference principle does. And that's how Rawls, I think Rawls is saying, look, parents are due just for childcare benefits under the difference principle, in addition to all the benefits that children themselves are due. Now, my sense is Dworkin doesn't distinguish these two things, and I wonder if his view is complex enough to take account not just of children's basic needs and basic education and medical costs and housing vouchers and all that sort of social welfare, but this is not social welfare. This is basically paying people a wage for productive labor. And that seems to be the way you want to use Dworkin. I wonder if he can bear that kind of pressure. That's the
Okay, I'll thank you very much. I need to think some more about some of the things you've raised. They're very helpful, but I want to say the following. I think, let's see, three things. One is I don't intend to rely on Dworkin alone for everything that I want to say. So I'm assuming that we can incorporate some of the considerations that I've listed, considerations of productive fairness, in a view that has other components. Right? So I don't see myself as embarking on a task of having equality of resources, say everything there is to be said about what children are owed and what is owed to parents. Secondly, the productive fairness claims that parents have. So I need to think more about this, because I need to think, so it's certainly the case that what I think Dworkin's view entails is that it would be unfair to parents if they had to pay for all the costs of parents. So again, there is a small debate where some people have said, Hillel Steiner, Peter Valentine, they've said under some conditions, we should really treat the choice to have and rear children as being comparable to any other expensive choice. And so on that view, parents would have to pay for the full costs as a matter of ideal justice, right? So assuming that they can indeed pay for their children's needs, they should pay for them entirely, right? So if they have their fair share of resources, what is prior to the arrival of a child, their fair share of resources, on the view that I'm responding to, it would be not only permitted by, but actually required by, so these people argue, by liberal egalitarian justice, to actually ask the procreative parent to just use his own bundle of resources. Others have to be buffered, so to speak, from any impact of the newcomer, right? So Dworkin's view might, and I'll need to think this through for sure carefully, might also entail that parents are owed a wage, but it also entails, I think, that something quite familiar, like the range of family policies that you've mentioned, that those are justified. What we don't want is to tell parents, paying for your children's needs has to come from your bundle of resources, just like we would say to Bruce, paying for your tennis playing has to come from your bundle. Right? So you pay for the land and we don't then refund you, or we don't subsidize the land, right? So in the case of parents, I'm saying we should, on his view, just like with Adrian, either subsidize the land and or pay him some wage. So, and the third thing I want to say is that so I take it, so I'm aware that there is one place I call it the standard view. So all liberal egalitarians, as far as I'm aware, with the exceptions I've mentioned, do believe that the cost of children should be socialized. But the question I take it is, are they right? Do they have an argument for that? Right? So do they have an argument for that in the face of certain challenges from personal responsibility and neutrality, and given other facts about the parental ambition that some people have thought are salient, namely parents derive great benefit from this, they don't do it for moral reasons, they don't do it to benefit others, having children is morally optional, so to speak. So I agree that Rawls and others do believe that we should socialize the cost of children. The question is, what's the argument for that claim? Thank you.
Now, we also have a question from Peter Wilson, so please.
Hi there. I very much enjoyed the presentation. Thanks very much for giving it. I had a question about, so you talked sort of about the case for socialization based on Dworkin's view, but it's not clear to me that we think that each parent should sort of get an equal wage, or each parent's cost should be socialized equally. I guess it wasn't so clear to me how that comes out of Dworkin's view, because it would seem it would depend a lot on how advantaged the parents were in various other ways. that would affect the opportunity cost, for example. So I kind of wanted to hear the step from we should subsidize to we should equally sort of subsidize. That'd be it. Thanks.
Thank you. So that's a very good question. So, but when I talk about equal subsidy, I should say, or when I refer to equal subsidy in the talk, I think I was referring to sharing equally the costs of children between parents and non-parents, rather than among parents themselves. Again, my target was the view that parents should bear most or all of the costs of children, assuming that they are the children's needs will not be compromised as a result. But with regard to, I mean, there are important and difficult questions about whether any case for socialization can accommodate certain intuitions that we have. And the public goods argument seems to be especially vulnerable to some problematic objections. So one thing that we, I think, believe is certainly that parents shouldn't receive more benefits if they, as a result of being advantaged, are able to produce children who are a greater asset to society, so to speak. And similarly, we might think it would be unfair if it were the case that that parents choose to have children with special needs to say that parents have to internalize the additional costs. So in terms of this issue, I think Dworkin's view does provide some help, in the sense that I think that we can say that there are various differences in the kinds of children that parents can produce, and in terms of also, or due also, among other things, not just to what Hillel Steiner calls golden genes. You know, some children have golden genes and others don't, but also because some parents are better parents than others, right? And some of these inequalities are, I think, ones that that people have would have kind of grounds to having offset or compensated. So when I think of these arguments, I always think of parents collectively rather than of individual parents. I think about how to set up the social role of parents. But having said that, I should say that there is one very tricky question, which is about the number of children that people choose to have. And I think to settle that question, a lot of other considerations kick in that have to do, among other things, with kind of climate justice issues, and then questions kick in also about what the relevant baseline is for determining whether or not parents having this number of children rather than a smaller number is still beneficial for relevant purposes, right? Does it still count as performing socially valuable work? Thank you. I can go on some more about roles before letting everybody enjoy their Friday afternoon. But sorry, there is a question.
I'll just jump in, I guess. Sorry, I didn't know that was the procedure here. Thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask maybe it's a kind of an odd kind of question. It's not really to do with any particular phase of the argument that you've given. For what it's worth, the context I'm in right now is the U.S. context, where, you know, we barely subsidize like the physical act of labor. I mean, of like actually giving birth to a baby, you know, much less compensate for parenting or anything else. And I'm just curious, sort of, what your view is about sort of the role of philosophy and philosophers such as yourself in policy formation and in public discussions about these kinds of things. I mean, I'm often struck by the conversations that we have, as a community of, moral or political philosophers, and how distant they feel from the world that we all live in. And, so I'm just curious, for somebody like yourself, what kinds of connections or bridges are there between the work that you're doing and the world outside us?
Thank you. Well, so, I mean, that question can be raised, I think, about, would be fatal about most of the work that I've done. But with regard to this particular work, I'm delighted to say that some social scientists have taken interest. And so this is not, I'm sure, due to the work itself, but to the fact that this issue is, so the public goods argument is an argument that is often voiced in public debates. And that various social scientists, most of them without developing it and without really kind of having a clear idea of what the argument they're invoking is, do invoke. And so I think there is already in public debates and among social scientists who I'm assuming are closer than I am to having some kind of influence on policy. There is already a kind of a fertile grounds, I think, for stepping in and saying, look, this is an argument that you put forward, but let's kind of think about what the argument exactly amounts to and whether it can be justified. And so, for example, I think one of the important things to be done in this area is, I think many social scientists, including Nancy Folber, who's repeatedly put forward versions of the public goods argument, but many social scientists, Robert Putnam, Gösta Esping Andersen, and many others who have worked also on kind of valorizing or trying to measure the externalities, fiscal positive externalities of children. Many of them, I think, run together forward-looking and backward-looking versions of the public goods argument. And I think in part because of that, the public goods argument might have a bad name among some of us philosophers, right? Because many of us have anti-pronatalist attitudes, in the sense that we think that because of concerns about population pressure and climate change, and because of the carbon footprint of children of well-off individuals in industrialized economies, that talking about children as public goods really kind of is worrying, right? So you may favor pronatalist policies that we should be instead guarding against. But I think, so my own view is that we should distinguish, for example, between a fairness-based claim and then the further claim as to whether we should encourage people whether to have more children. And I think everything that I've said about the public goods argument is compatible with it being constrained by, or even generating itself, some requirements that the subsidy, if you like, or I don't want to say subsidy, but the support for parenting kind of fade off or decrease, unlike, say, what was the case, I don't know whether it still is in France, rather than increase as the number of children that couples have increases. But yeah, so I can cite, so that's all I can say. I mean, there is a fertile kind of debate in the public arena, and social scientists are talking about, are interested in public goods arguments. So I think that in this case, philosophers, maybe more than philosophers can make a difference to how discussions impact public policy.
Just to kind of continue, Serena. So the two distinct problems, and it seems, and I mean both of them involve feminist issues certainly. So one is the providing for basic needs of children, and the kindergarten education, nutritional needs and so on, health needs, and that kind of general, very liberal, social democratic, social welfare view. And then the other is fair compensation of labor for childcare, right? And it seemed like you were, when you started out, you were addressing that second one, compensating stay-at-home parents for raising children because they're engaged in socially productive labor. But then it sort of, there's also this element of cost sharing and paying for children and just justifying sort of standard, let's say, social democratic welfare programs, which really doesn't compensate parents for their labor, right? So the question is, well, you're really going to compensate Melania Trump for staying at home with little whatever his name is? Well, of course not, right? So then the problem is how you're going to deal with, certainly women, should be compensated for raising children, let's say, on a sort of a left liberal egalitarian view, because they're not able to go out and work, right? And but we need to find some principle that doesn't compensate Melania Trump for raising, the Trumplet. So that's where I think you mentioned Rawls. That's where I think Rawls' difference principle is going to deal with that problem. That is going to set, determine a fair return for parents, usually women, staying at home and raising children, people who otherwise would go out and work without compensating people who are well off, right? Like Melania Trump, who are just don't have to work and so on. I mean that's the way I would read Rawls, and it's all based on this one comment he made. I can't remember. I think it was in Justice Fairness. It may have been in the Public Reason Revisited paper on the section on the family, but I imagine you would remember that if it were. So it may have been, instead it may have been somewhere else. I can't remember where things are like I used to. But as I read him, he did envision, certainly working class people at least, and maybe even middle class people and so on, having a right to a fair, you might say, wage for staying for childcare costs a lot of money for women who go out and work or men who go out and work, and the idea was we need to cover those costs so they can, if they themselves do it, without raising this problem of compensating Melania Trump, right? Yeah. My concern was, I wonder if Dworkin's position is really constructed to deal with that kind of problem. I mean, maybe it is the way you.
It's. I mean, thank you. So I think, the Melania Trump case, I think confounds our judgment because she's very unjustly well off. So we have to ask whether in a society in which there are better off people, but they're better off because they're just, right? Whether they would be entitled to kind of child tax credits and so on. And so I'm not hostile to saying that they should. So again, if they are indeed incurring costs and doing double shifts, right? Then I think, and if they're justly better off than others, then I do think that there is something to be said in favor of the fact that they shouldn't suffer a disadvantage relative to people who produce on the market with those extra hours. So in part, in part, I want to bite the bullet and say that that if we take seriously the idea that this is socially necessary and productive labor, then at least under some conditions, we have to, supposing that's to say that people are not already in possession of a vast amount of unjustly held resources, that then, recognizing that what they're doing is socially valuable, necessary, indispensable work does require that we, if you like, in some sense, pay for that. Yes, I'm committed to that, and I think, you know, I don't see how even rules. So the passages that I remember from rules are on reproductive work being socially necessary work. I remember that being in justice as fairness, in a couple of places in justice as fairness. And but what I thought was interesting about Rawls, and this is something I need to think more about, but was that he's clearly willing to take on board some of the qualms that, especially I take it in response to Oken's engagement with his work. He recognizes he has to accommodate, and he thinks he's able to accommodate. But I think what he does do is to then mostly think of the case that Oken has made and that he takes on board as being about indeed the gender dimension, the gender inequality dimension. So in some passages in Justice and Fairness, he cites the claim that reproductive labor is socially necessary. But then he says in response, what we'll have to do is to ensure that women don't bear a greater burden of it than men. And so that their fair equality is not compromised, fair equality of opportunity is not compromised for women. So parents must share this burden fairly among them. So what I want to suggest is that the diagnosis of the injustice must do justice to the idea that this is socially necessary work and unjustly treated for that reason. That's to say, when it's being an injustice that is not recognized and not rewarded in some sense, is not reducible to the fact that it's unequally divided along gender lines, right? Mm-hmm. So in my view, you know, if you had a world in which, if we can envisage that, in which women and men, you know, to take Dick Arneson's idea of the statistical equal split, right? So we can't tell, we don't have equal split a la Oken, but we have a society in which we can't tell whether someone is a carer, full-time carer, or a full-time worker, or splits work on the basis of their gender, right? So we know that statistically, taking men and women on the aggregate, there is no inequality between them in those respects. But suppose it's still the case that the role of parent is extremely costly, right? So that people who parent, as opposed to choose not to have children, do work incredibly long double shifts to be able to pay for their children's childcare and so on. I think that would be an injustice in that scenario too. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of the injustice that feminists want to indict. Of course, it's all the worse, much worse, given that it's divided along gender lines and accompanied by many other manifestations of gender injustice. But there is that too, I believe, in what feminists complain about.
Thank you. I think Misha Glaser, just one very short question, please, and a very short answer, please.
Yeah, I sort of took my hand down already because I thought that Serena had already kind of responded to it. I just wanted to also push back a bit against the notion that Melania Trump, that it's so implausible that Melania Trump would deserve compensation. Because, I mean, one way of looking at it is, I mean, on the Dworkin model, right? I mean, raising children is sort of to be treated as though, you know, like tomato planting or something, right? And we wouldn't find it obvious that she, I mean, all the differences, you know, being given their due, but we wouldn't think it obvious that she doesn't kind of deserve to be compensated for tomato planting activities, or put it more cautiously, that the fact that she's more wealthier than someone else who might want to plant tomatoes shouldn't necessarily make a difference to the pricing of everything. Now you could reject, you know, that's the right way of looking at it. But maybe one thing that highlights is that there really is a difference between how Rawls would treat the issue if it's folded under the difference principle and how Dworkin would treat it. But I think within the Dworkin system, it's not necessarily even a bullet to bite.
Thank you. Yeah, I do have a question, actually. Am I allowed in closing to ask a question back? Or is this a complete breach of... So I have a question about
Very
roles.
short,
So very, very short. So what would roles say of two people? One is a parent, one is a non-parent. In terms of the bundle of their primary social goods, with the exception of leisure, they are equal, because the parent is just, works double shifts. She's a super parent, so she does everything that the other person does, and so she has the same commands, the same bundle of primary social goods. So I take it. So I think we want to be able to register that difference between them by appeal to something like productive fairness, right? And I'm not sure, would roles be able to capture that?
The problem is Melania Trump is she doesn't take care of her child. She pays somebody else to do it.
Somebody else, exactly.
And the fact is that the vast majority of well-off people do that. So the question is, if you imagine a universal payment for childcare that goes to parents, then why should we give why should we pay for Melania Trump's paying for someone else to take care of her kids? That's the problem. And so that's why I think it needs some kind of, it's not just Melania Trump, it's, just a lot of people pay for the kids and they're very wealthy. And you think that, well, you shouldn't have working class people pay taxes to pay for the child care for wealthy people. I mean, so I think it's to look at child care by the parent, stay-at-home parent, as productive labor that needs to be compensated regardless of a person's income group. I sort of have trouble with that. And you're right. I mean, I think maybe in Rawls's view, there was some implication of that, but I think if you thought about it, you would see the problem with giving Melania Trump money, because she's going to take the money, it's going to just reduce her childcare costs, right? So, and that's where I see the problem lying. Yeah. But interesting issue.
Yeah. I know I'm not allowed to speak anymore. Thank you very much for your comments and questions.
Okay, then. So I'm just going to wrap up. So thank you, Serena. Thank you to the three keynote speakers and to all participants in this edition. It was a pleasure, a tiresome pleasure, but a pleasure nonetheless to hold these meetings with so many interesting talks. And I hope you've also enjoyed them as much as we did. And see you perhaps at the next Braga meetings or one of our other events at SEPS. And well, goodbye to all in the name of, obviously, of the organizing committee and SEPS as a whole.
Let me just add, I would like to express my gratitude to all the researchers of SEPS that helped sharing, and thank everybody who participated, and see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.